All right. So now we have a presentation of the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, and I'll hand this over to Casey Stanley, our Parks Director.
Thank you. We have Daniel Robbins, the Parks and Recreation Deputy Director here tonight to present on the PROS plan, Parks, Recreation, Open Space Plan. So I'll pass it off to him. He's virtual tonight.
Thanks, Casey, and thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council. I'm Daniel Robin, the Deputy Director of the Parks and Recreation and Cultural Services Department. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce Council to the Burien Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, or PROS plan, and provide a framework for subsequent presentations of the 90% draft plan and final PROS plan for adoption that will take place in January and February of 2024. Every 6 years, the City of Burien Parks Department works with the community to update the existing PROS plan. Once adopted by the Burien City Council, the PROS plan helps guide the city's management and development of park properties and recreation programs. The PROS plan process is a grant funding eligibility requirement set by the State of Washington Recreation and Conservation Office. The PROS plan also helps the city fulfill the Growth Management Act planning requirements for comprehensive plan elements outlined by the Washington State Department of Commerce. It also helps the city be eligible for other state and federal grants for acquisition and development of parks and recreational facilities. I will now turn the presentation over to Emily Pittsburgh and Lean El-Haraki from Design Workshop to provide an overview of the PROS plan elements.
Thanks, Daniel. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. As Daniel mentioned, I have Lean here with me who will help me present, and Anna Laybourne, who is our principal in charge, couldn't be here tonight. Next slide, please. On our agenda today, we are going to look at the plan purpose and plan overview. We're going to look into elements of the plan, including community input, feedback, system analysis, themes and goals, and CIP prioritization, and then we'll quickly touch on next steps. Next slide, please. The purpose of this plan is to guide the future of Burien's parks, recreation, and open spaces over the next 6 years. This plan will provide recommendations that support a future holistic system and provide opportunities for enhancement. Burien's current parks and recreation assets provide invaluable benefits for the community with diverse recreation opportunities. The plan envisions a future where current assets in the city are cared for and new system improvements are planned to achieve equitable outcomes in the future. This presentation will provide an introduction to the 4 plan themes and goals, a system map noting the locations of all parks, sites, and recreation facilities, and a mapping analysis update. Next. So Parks and Recreation is really an anchor for the community. They provide opportunities for community health, including physical and mental health, encourage physical activity, provide education programs for youth, and really strengthen communities by bringing people together and connecting them with nature. And in Burien, we understand that there's a lot being done with little resources. So what we know that Burien's park system has 28 parks, 4 trail corridors, 2 community centers, and 11 miles of trails. And with all this, we're looking at this as a whole for improvements. The previous PROS plan in 2018 set baseline strategies to get the park system to what it is today. And this plan is about expanding the system to achieve benefits for the future, for the community as a whole. Next. And so we're going to talk about some key takeaways. We were really fortunate to be able to visit Burien back in September, and we were able to hear many different perspectives from the department leaders and from staff, from maintenance crew, and even from staff at the Mosier Art Center. And we saw this overwhelming passion of the Parks and Recreation Department. There's many behind the scenes efforts to acquire and sustain funding sources and keep the standard of service up to par with the few resources that they do have. The maintenance crew has a lot of ownership over the Burien's park spaces, and they go above and beyond to service and maintain their parks. We were able to interact with park users, and they have a very obvious appreciation for local parks, which really adds a lot of value to the system. We saw a really positive impact of the recreation programming and after school recreation programming. Specialized needs programs were really impactful at the Mercer Art Center, and we plan to carry that on through this plan. And generally, there are a lot of really great park spaces in this plan. We're looking to utilize the existing park spaces that celebrate the natural aspects of the park system while improving amenities and access for the community. Next slide. Climate change is leading to dire health and economic consequences. The park system on its own cannot be the solution to all climate change issues, but parks can help mitigate through stormwater management practices, and help reduce urban heat island effects and air pollution. Maintenance and funding limitations could impact system expansions. I just want to reiterate that the maintenance team, although a small crew, is doing a lot with a little. Funding is uncertain, and year-to-year changes can affect the long-term plans for the park system. With this plan, we are hoping to make recommendations for more sustainable and long-term planning. The need for equitable access to safe parks and open spaces is a challenge. And an important component of this plan is to conduct an equity analysis. Even with Burien's existing park acreage, it's difficult to achieve uniform geographic distributions. Next slide, which I think we're out of order. I'm sorry, can we go back to opportunities? Thanks. So some of the opportunities that we saw, parks and recreation centers are critical infrastructure for positive health outcomes. Parks and community centers are opportunities for youth and adults to stay active. We were lucky during our site visit to be able to see how park spaces were activated throughout the day by park users, families, and after-school programs. And even more, parks and recreation are important, not only from the physical lens, but also from a passive recreation and arts programming and mental health lens. Providing recreation and educational opportunity is a community-wide effort. And we found in the community input, which we'll get into more momentarily, that there were comments related to outdoor education and signage, utilizing park spaces for more organized activities such as outdoor classrooms or education programs. And there's an opportunity to build partnerships and volunteerism, which is really a community-wide effort. And lastly, integration of public art and representation bolstered community ownership. And Burien park spaces already share public art. And there's an opportunity to expand that, which can provide more opportunities for cultural and historic connections and identity. Next, please. Now we're going to jump into some community input. So with the Shape Your City initiative, efforts were launched that allowed community members to reimagine the long-term future of the community. The coordinated planning effort, which gathered feedback for the comprehensive plan update, a new transportation master plan, and an update to the parks and recreation and open space plan. This effort considered community development, transportation improvements, and park preferences. And alongside that, some of the other engagement efforts and events that took place were email connection and social pinpoint, community and tabling events, user group discussions, and workshops. Next slide, please. Following the Shape Your City initiative survey, the Parks Department launched a follow-up survey to better understand the needs of the community and the park system. The questions addressed more park and recreation specific considerations, including user demand and visitation, safety and accessibility perceptions, recreation program interest, and park specific improvements. The survey feedback helped inform key themes, goals, and strategies for the plan. And currently we're working through feedback from previous board and commission meetings, as well as comments from the December open house that will help refine our themes and goals moving forward. Next slide. So we're just going to go through some kind of key points and takeaways that we heard from some of the engagement. In phase one, we learned that parks in Burien are the third highest visited destination behind only restaurants and being at home. And then when asked where more parks were needed in Burien, Lake Burien access, the Ambaum and First Avenue corridors, and Boulevard Park were among the top responses. Most respondents were interested in walking paths, urban forests, and other natural spaces when asked what amenities they would like to see in Burien parks. And safety and diversity were among the top responses when asked to imagine an ideal Burien in 2044. And then lastly, Seahurst and Lake Burien School Memorial Parks were among the most appreciated parks in Burien. Next. In the phase 2 more park specific engagement, Parks, Recreation, Open Space Survey, we learned that while walkability and access are important, many respondents expressed the desire for additional secure parking to be able to visit parks more often. Residents unanimously agree that parks are important to the quality of life at 94% of users and respondents believing that. And there's an interest in integrating more public art and concentrated in high visibility areas, including street side murals and sculptures. At about 80% of respondents would like to see more murals. Next. The more recent effort focused on more park-specific feedback for 6 identified parks. These parks include Hilltop Park, Chelsea, Southern Heights, and Jacob Ambom Parks, Salmon Creek Ravine, and the Boulevard Park neighborhood. So some of the key takeaways from these responses were generally improving park amenities such as courts, fields, and trails, providing safe pedestrian access across major and busy corridors, and as well as ADA accessibility improvements across all parks, increased tree canopy for shade, and better maintained and updated playgrounds. Next slide, please. Additional things that we heard were improvements to signage and wayfinding within parks themselves. And the system as a whole, better lighting, and generally community members were supportive of a park within the Boulevard Park neighborhood. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Lean, who's going to talk about system analysis.
Thank you, Emily. Next, we will provide sort of a run through of all the key areas that the system analysis is going to include. I will caveat this by saying that a lot of these maps and findings are in progress, and we are looking forward to finalizing this analysis in the plan document, but we wanted to share what to expect and what will be included in the plan. Next. So firstly, the plan starts with a park inventory along with an overview of the Parks Department's investment history. This will be detailed in the plan to provide context on the parks and facility assets that are already available in the city. In addition to the inventory, a park assessment was carried out by the Parks Department to rate the parks and centers within the system based on their existing conditions, level of development, safety, and the number of amenities available. These parks were given an overall scoring based on the rating system, and those results were mapped as well for easier visualization. Those ratings will be further analyzed in the plan document, and then they will be linked to specific strategies that we will discuss in a moment. Next, we've also used park visitation data in this plan. We looked at visitation data from SoPark and from Near software. This data is still raw and needs further analysis to fine-tune some of the results. But the findings will be presented in greater detail in the plan document. Those will include an overview of the system-wide visit counts collected on a monthly basis to understand seasonal park use, average dwell times that indicate the amount of time spent at parks and community facilities, and the demographic characteristics of users, including the age, race, educational background, and income levels for park visitors. And this data will allow us to understand how park user trends change over time and how the user demographics compare to the City of Burien's demographics. Next. So we are conducting a level of service analysis that helps us understand the park acreage and distribution across the City of Burien. In addition to the level of service, we are looking at a walkshed gap analysis. The walkshed is calculated based on a quarter-mile buffer from neighborhood and smaller parks and a half-mile buffer for community and larger parks. The parcels within the walkshed gaps are areas where park access is difficult or challenging. And so those were overlaid with the number of residential units by parcel in order to calculate and understand residential densities in areas that do not have easy access to parks and open spaces. This provides us with a more nuanced understanding of access gaps and allows the department to prioritize park system expansion in the future. Next. As Emily mentioned, a robust equity analysis is a critical component of this plan, and it will not only drive the plan strategies, but also the CIP prioritization process, which we will discuss next. The equity analysis is composed of 4 different subcategories, and those categories have been identified as having direct impact on park and recreation equity considerations. The first is community health, and this combines data on demographic characteristics and health conditions, including susceptibility to disease. Access and equity includes parks and open space accessibility, as well as levels of tree canopy coverage. Access to public transit is also factored in here for residents who do not own a private vehicle. The third category is climate and exposure, which overlays heat risk, air quality, traffic proximity, flooding risk, sea level rise, and other hazards. And lastly, the community equity subcategory captures socioeconomic conditions, vehicle ownership, housing, and employment characteristics. Next slide. And then all of those factors are combined to generate an overall equity index that the Parks Department can use for future decision-making and prioritization. This mapping process also is going to be included in the plan and details how we got to these results and how they can be used for the park system expansion.
Thanks, Lean. So we're going to jump into kind of a high-level overview of our key themes, goals, and strategies with what we've been working on and taking into account community input, analysis, and review of previous plans. We have developed 4 key plan themes, and these are still in working order, and we'll continue to develop these as we dive into findings. Next slide, please. So the first goal theme that we'll talk about is plan for the future of a holistic system. This theme imagines a plan and a parks and recreation system for all. It encompasses building a legacy for growth, improvement, and impact that allows for longevity. Here we look to address Burien's parks and recreation system as a whole by addressing gaps and inequities, planning for future park improvements, by acknowledging community engagement feedback and providing maintenance and funding recommendations. Next slide, please. The next theme is support community health and wellness. This theme encompasses the way community members use parks, facilities, and programs. This is about emphasizing the importance of parks and recreation, highlighting partnerships and programs, and crafting inclusivity for all. It's about encouraging the use of parks, recreation, and programming as a shared space. Next. Sustain and celebrate the natural environment focuses on honoring Burien's natural systems through educational opportunities, encouraging the continuation of park restoration efforts, and efforts that are focused on mitigating climate change and natural hazard impacts on parks. Next. Lastly, foster community connection and identity. It emphasizes creating unique experiences for Burien's park system users through thoughtful program and event planning, activating park spaces, creating experiences that reinforce character and identity, and expanding the way youth can shape the park system. Next slide, please. And now we will get into our CIP prioritization framework. Briefly. So to help guide the Parks and Recreation Department with selecting projects to be funded, a framework for decision-making has been established through 4 priorities. These priorities are equity priority zones, level of service, opportunities, and existing conditions. These 4 areas will consider different factors within the equity priority. We will focus on climate exposure and conditions, community health and equity, and access to parks and recreation within the opportunity priority. Maintenance and replacement needs, features and amenities and scale of improvements will be determined. And then within level service, park watershed areas, residential density and visitation and intensity of use will be reviewed. And finally, within opportunities, feasibility of acquisition and system expansion, partnerships and community initiative and available funding sources will be studied and considered. And then next slide. So for our next steps, we are looking at a 90% draft presentation back with council towards the end of January, as well as meeting back with the Joint Arts Commission and Parks Advisory Boards and looking at adoption late February. Council final presentation late February. And with that, I will close out and see if anybody has questions.
Deputy Mayor Schilling.
First of all, thank you for the work on this. I have two questions. The first is just a statistical question, and the second is a aspirational statement mixed with a question. So my first question on statistics is your slide you had around the number of visitors per year per park. How did you get that number? What was the methodology behind collecting that number?
So we are using Near software, which is a software that allows us to access visitation data by using by pinging cell phone devices. Those devices are anonymous. It just provides us with an overall count and then matches demographic information to Burien's census data. And this is data that we're fine-tuning with the city to make sure, with the Parks Department, to make sure that it reflects the reality of park usage in within Burien. And we're also going to be using SoPark survey data, which gives us 3 days of in-person observation data to make sure that those numbers are also aligned and they make sense. And I guess the goal here is to accurately portray how the system is being used currently and to be able to develop parks based on this information.
Well, that's really fascinating. Could we put that slide back up, please? Because my question and my aspirational thought has to do with it. I'm also just curious because I saw a park that had a huge number, and I want to ask a question about that. Yeah, so Miller Creek Trail, with almost, this is saying almost 18,000 visits a year. I don't know about that, Casey.
And I guess that's where my disclaimer came from. Both Miller Creek and Salmon Creek Ravine were trying to re-upload boundary layers for it to make sure that we got accurate counts.
Okay.
And so that's part of the iterative process that we're going through with the Parks Department to make sure that the numbers are realistic. But
now, I mean, don't get me wrong. I would love to have 18,000 people walk on Miller Creek Trail every year, and 18,000 walk on the Salmon Creek Ravine, which I buy that more because it's connected to Seahurst, and there's a neighborhood up that people walk up and down the hill and go through. I guess my aspiration here is not necessarily to say. I guess I will say that I would. Within this, I think that there are some parks that we all understand why there are so many visitors to some of these parks. And then there are some parks where we all understand why there's not as many. Like Jacob Ambom Park is a really difficult park to get to. Off of Ambom, busy street. I can understand why there's a smaller number of visits. But then there's some parks on here that are kind of shocking to me at the level that they're being picked up. Like Lakeview Park has a dog park, which is separate from that there. But I'm curious when we get to the discussion around investments, how we're going to prioritize distribution of resources. Are we going to be doing it with a philosophy and methodology around, okay, we have so many people visiting certain parks, we need to invest more in those spaces, or do we need to invest more in the spaces that are being underutilized? Like Matheson Park, 2,392. It's a great park. It has an awesome little trail, but not a whole lot of people live around it. but it does have a kids playground. Or Town Square Park. No way there's only 2,427 people going to Town Square Park every year when it's right in the center of downtown. So, I want to make sure that we're utilizing our data effectively so that when we do discuss and decide on resource allocation, we're doing it with an awareness that we have appropriate data that meets those needs. So I wanted to say that I think that however we can pinpoint this down a little bit more would be super helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we were looking at this data too, we were a little surprised, and we really needed to dig down deeper to figure out, what were those visits? Were there any overlays of like construction projects happening where there were people at those parks and the duration of the parks? What was it picking up along, what did that border of those parks, and were they picking them up? And so I know that we really need to do a lot more kind of data crunching to look at that, and then do the overlay of like the equity and the mapping of the other areas that we're looking at to see how that fits in with our priority.
Gotcha. Yeah, I agree. And I think one of my aspirational thoughts too is that we utilize transit-oriented development as a way to get incentives for folks to build more density around transit. I would love to start a discussion around parks and green space-oriented development, where we can say that we have all these green spaces, we're trying to incentivize an increased use in them, and we want healthier communities. Well, one great way to do that is by living near a park, being able to go through the park, walk in the park. When I lived in New York City, I walked through Central Park every single day.
Other questions? Councilmember Sarah.
I also want to start by just saying thank you for presenting this. I was on the Parks and Recreations committee when I think last time the pros plan was going through, and it's wonderful, and I really appreciate the work that has happened since then. It's great to see the interest in taking that broader picture of how parks are used. And I also share with Deputy Mayor Schilling just a real fascination with that use. And some of my takeaways were a little different. I looked at Jacob Anbaum and thought I could fit that in the basketball court of Southern Heights Park, which has about a third the number of visits. And that tells me like Jacob Anbaum is in a neighborhood that's crying out for more park access because people are obviously just packing it in as much as they can. I do want to say about Southern Heights Park that kids walk there on their own and may not have phones. So there may be missed counts going on with that, but not to the point where it's more visited than some of those other parks. I did have a couple of questions. One was about the heat island effect and what how effective parks can be in mitigating that, and whether that's the trees in the parks or whether it's just not having asphalt there, what the biggest contribution they have to it.
I think you hit it on the head. There's several factors. I mean, it's providing tree canopy that provides shade and mitigates that heat. It is providing or selecting the right materials for improvements. I mean, those are the two top considerations, I would say, when we consider heat island. Yeah.
So I had a couple, if a city wants more park access, like if you're in, you have the map and you have here's where the parks are and here's where the parks are. And if you wanted more parks in that area, what are the things Burien can do to make that happen? I mean, would we buy more land? I know we kind of purchased from the school district. So what are some possible ways that would happen?
Yeah, there's a couple different things that we could do. One would be purchasing land, so acquisition, so identifying lots, start working and putting the word out there that we're looking for spaces or green spaces around this area and see if anybody and it makes sense for where those parks are at, and to then go through that process. Obviously, that would be grant funding that we'd be looking for to be able to purchase those properties. The other is having partnerships So like we have a couple parks with the school district. So we had Lakeview, which we're purchasing from them. We also have Manhattan, which is, we have a partnership agreement where we use their space and we have it as a park. We have Southern Heights, which is owned by the water district, and we have a park there. So that's another way of doing, adding green spaces, and then also encouraging other developers that are doing bigger developments to have park spaces too within their developments.
Other questions for Casey? Councilmember Garcia.
Thanks. I want to thank you for the work so far. This is an intense lift, so thank you for the work. Also to the contractor in place, thank you for the work you guys are doing. It's heavy, it's tough. I shared the same questions with Deputy Mayor. That was the one question I had, like, how did you get that data? So it was very fascinating to hear that you're basically using cell phone pinging. That's fascinating. And like it was discussed, I think I'd love to hear a little bit more, if you could elaborate more, Aline, on the second part. I think you mentioned something about like a 3-day potential visitation check or another system of checking visitations, because I do think that just some of those numbers are really skewed. Obviously, some of these parks, like the ravines that the Deputy Mayor mentioned, it's more like people just driving by, really. So would love to hear a little bit more about that before I follow up on my second question.
Yeah, so the SOPARC data, it's a survey that we didn't conduct ourselves, and then maybe Daniel could elaborate on how we got access to this data, but it basically provides us with observation data on how the parks are being used, what levels of activity are happening, and what types of activities people are engaging in, whether they're walking, playing organized sports, so on and so forth. So we get a level of detail that we're not able to get through visitation data. And Daniel, maybe you can explain how we got the SOPARC data.
Yeah, so the SOPARC data is a pilot program that we partnered with King County Department of Health for. I believe it's like through their lunch program division. So they had gotten some initial grant funding to do a trial study where they picked some parks in some designated cities, I think us and SeaTac and a couple other cities. And of these selected parks, they did 3 days of on-site observations to see how many people were at the park at those days, what kind of activities they were doing, and they took very basic demographic information such as age. I don't believe they looked at ethnicity, but so just some very basic demographics on that, and just recorded it. And they did it, I believe, 5 times a day on those 3 days. They did like 2 mornings, a midday, and then 2 afternoon observations. And so we just got that data from them and we're analyzing it right now. So it's kind of a backup to, we're kind of using it to look at with the near data, with the cell phone data, we're looking at it to kind of back it up and then get a little bit more detail as to what actually was happening in the parks during those times. Because the near data just tells you that there are people there, but doesn't necessarily tell you what they're doing. So it's a little bit more in-depth study that shows us what people are doing, and we can see, what are people using the parks as we have them currently developed? Are they doing other activities that maybe we haven't programmed and we need to consider? So it just kind of gives us that little bit level of detail. And so that was just a 1-year program. We're hoping to see if we can try to do a couple more years of that study so we can really dive in and get to know how our community are using the parks. But that's kind of the basic rundown of what the SOPARC data is.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. My follow-up on that would be, I guess, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. If there's any, I know that in January, we're due to get a presentation, 90% done. If there is any time allowable, funding allowable within the contract to do any on-site park data search within that time frame or future time frame, I'd be more trustful of data of actual visits in person. I know manpower, women power, physically be at parks is challenging, but I think that would be something that would help to alleviate some of the comments shared by Councilmember Sarah Moore and Deputy Mayor on some of these parks. Some make a lot of sense, some don't make any sense. There's two parks mentioned that I visit regularly, and they're completely opposite in data, and they're very close. They're just a little bit small, different in size. So we do still have some time, if at all possible. I think it'd be great to get more. And if we could get the information on the dates of when you got that King County data, I'd be interested to find out, like, was that closer to the pandemic? When was it? What time of the year was it? Which parks did they go to in Buren to get that, since we're relying on that to fine tune the digital cell phone tower data. And I guess the follow-up question was, you somewhat answered it, but I would love to know if there's any timeline as to us acquiring the parks that you mentioned. I did see the Southern Heights Park is owned by the Water District. We're very close to finalizing the acquisition. I truly believe that is the best way for us to have that aspirational look of having the best parks in all of the county, which I think we can and we do have that potential to have. And would love for us to find a more detailed plan, hopefully discuss that throughout the year for us to actually acquire more of these parks. Thank you.
Any other questions for Casey? Councilmember Sarah?
I have one more. I saw that the highest number of wishes was a park at Lake Burien. And I know that corresponds to what I've sort of anecdotally heard people say. You know, if they could have one thing in Burien, it would be park access to that lake. How feasible is that? And what if any pathway is there to it? Because it's something that does come up, it bubbles up, I think, for as long as I can remember, as a topic of conversation.
Yeah, I would say I've heard that as long as I've been in Burien. I would have to get back to you with more information on that. I think there's a lot to that. There needs to be available land. There needs to be agreement to allow for public access. So it'd be a pretty big lift for the city to purchase some land on Lake Burien to be able to provide access. But we can, I mean, as we saw, that was a high priority on our list, so we need to do some research into that. It's okay. So I'd have to, hopefully we can come back with some information in the pros plan around those guidelines a little bit.
I think it would be helpful because, if we're looking at, do we put a whole lot of resources at a park at a lake, or how many other parks could we have with the same resources is sort of the question that rises for me.
Councilmember Moore?
I just want to follow up with that kind of thought. Well, first of all, thank you for all of the work that's gone into this and such in-depth information. But in talking about equity, when we're talking about access to amenities in our city, not having public access to a main water feature, it is something that obviously is of great concern to many in our community. And when we're talking about equity, that is certainly a sore spot for a lot of people. And I know that it is a difficult thing for the city to try and deal with. Wouldn't it be lovely if somebody decided to gift us a piece of property? But if not, I think that continuing to look at pathways that we might pursue access for the public would be good. That's my 2 cents, and continues to be something that is echoed, and we all know that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Casey and team.